The air hung heavy with the scent of fresh bread and the faint tang of citrus. As Cleon stepped out of the grocery store, his reusable canvas bag slung casually over his shoulder, dusk had settled over the city like a soft blanket, the sky awash in swirling hues of deep purple and fiery orange, a sight that never failed to stir something peaceful in him. He took a slow, deliberate breath, savoring the coolness that brushed against his skin as the automatic doors hissed shut behind him. For once, he wasn't Captain Cleon, the man whose very presence could hush a room the moment he stepped into it, his police uniform crisp and commanding. Tonight, he was just Cleon, a man in faded jeans and a worn gray sweatshirt, blending seamlessly into the hum of everyday life. It was a rare gift, this fleeting chance to shed the weight of his badge, to escape the relentless demands of a career that had tested him in ways few could understand. From the day he'd first pinned that badge to his chest, Cleon had known the road wouldn't be easy. Being a black man in law enforcement came with a unique set of burden stars that lingered too long. Whispered doubts about his loyalty, the constant need to prove he belonged. Yet he'd faced every challenge with a quiet, unyielding resolve, his broad shoulders carrying not just the weight of his own ambitions, but the expectations of those who doubted him. Over the years, he'd climbed the ranks not through backroom deals or flattery, but through sheer grit, sharp intellect, and a grace that surprised even his harshest critics. Now, as a captain, he often paused to reflect on the distance he'd traveled, a journey marked by late nights, hard choices, and a steady belief that justice wasn't just a word, but a promise he'd sworn to keep. Tonight, though, justice felt far away. All he wanted was to sink into the simplicity of this moment, the rhythmic clatter of a cyclist's wheels against the pavement, the burst of laughter from a group of teenagers huddled on the corner, their voices rising and falling like a song. Cleon's lips curved into a faint smile as he adjusted the bag on his shoulder, the loaf of sourdough he'd picked up jostling against a jar of marinara sauce. He could already picture the evening ahead, soft jazz playing low in his apartment, the rich aroma of garlic simmering on the stove, a glass of red wine in hand as he unwound with his partner, Jackson. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a gentle interruption to his reverie. Fishing it out, he glanced at the screen. "Hey, when you getting back? Hungry over here." Jackson's familiar tone brought a warmth to Cleon's chest. He tapped out a quick reply, "On my way now. Just grabbed groceries. See you in 10. And slid the phone back into his jeans, his steps light as he turned toward home. The street stretched out before him, alive with the quiet bustle of early evening. A woman pushed a stroller past him, her toddler babbling excitedly about a pigeon waddling nearby. An older man shuffled along with a newspaper tucked under his arm, muttering to himself about the weather. Cleon let his mind drift, the tension of his day paperwork piled high. A rookie officer's complaint about protocol slipping away like sand through his fingers. His badge and gun rested in the small purse slung beneath his arm, hidden from view, a silent reminder of the life he carried even in these unguarded moments. But for now, he was content to be invisible, just another soul weaving through the city's heartbeat. 2 blocks away, Officer Trent Oliver sat restless in his squad car, the leather seat creaking under his shifting weight. The day had been a slog, nothing but a handful of petty calls, a fender bender on 3rd Street, a neighbor griping about a barking dog. For Trent, it was maddening. He'd signed up for the force with visions of high-stakes chases and dramatic arrests, not this tedious parade of paperwork and warnings. Young and brash, with only a few years under his belt, he wore his confidence like armor, convinced his instincts were sharper than any training manual. Sometimes they were his quick thinking had earned him a commendation last spring, when he'd talked down a drunk man waving a broken bottle. But other times, those same instincts curdled into something darker, tangled up in biases he didn't even recognize in himself. Tonight, he itched for action, his fingers drumming an impatient rhythm against the steering wheel, his blue eyes scanning the empty street with a hunger he couldn't quite name. The radio crackled to life, slicing through the stillness. Dispatch to all units, 10 to 31 in progress. Robbery suspect, black female, mid-30s, dark jeans, gray sweatshirt, last seen heading west on 5th and Maple. The dispatcher's voice was steady, but laced with urgency. and Trent's pulse leapt in response. "Unit 34, copy that." He barked into the mic, already throwing the car into gear. Heading to 5th and Maple now. His heart thudded against his ribs, a surge of adrenaline flooding his veins as he gripped the wheel tighter. Tires squealing as he peeled around a corner. This was the kind of call he lived for. In his mind, he was already the hero, picturing the suspect cuffed in the back of his car, his name buzzing through the precinct by morning. Black female, mid-30s, dark jeans. Gray sweatshirt description looped through his head like a mantra. As he sped toward the intersection, his eyes darting over every figure on the sidewalk. Then he saw him. Clean ambled along the street, his pace unhurried, the grocery bag swaying gently with each step. The soft glow of a street lamp caught the gray of his sweatshirt, the dark denim of his jeans. And Trent's breath hitched. It was perfect to perfect. Mid-30s, black, gray sweatshirt, dark jeans. His mind snapped shut like a trap, every detail aligning with the dispatcher's words. He didn't pause to question it, didn't consider the bag of groceries or the relaxed slump of Clean's shoulders. To Trent, this was the suspect, plain and simple, and his blood roared with the thrill of the chase. He eased the cruiser to the curb, his eyes locked on Clean's back, every muscle in his body coiled tight. The man hadn't noticed him yet, hadn't sensed the storm brewing just steps behind. "Ma'am, stop right there." Trent's voice boomed into the night, sharp and commanding, bouncing off the brick facades lining the street. Clean froze mid-stride, the words hitting him like a jolt of electricity. His brow furrowed, confusion rippling through him as he turned slowly, squinting into the blinding glare of the cruiser's headlights. "Ma'am," the misgendering threw him off, but it was the officer's tone, hard, unyielding, that sent a shiver of unease down his spine. For a split second, he wondered if he'd stumbled into someone else's scene, if this was meant for another figure lurking nearby. But the lights pinned him in place, and the realization sank in. This was about him. "Is there a problem, officer?" Clean asked, his voice steady despite the faint tremor of irritation creeping in. He'd been here before, not as the target, but as the one responding, diffusing, controlling. He knew the playbook: keep calm, stay measured, let reason prevail. But the young officer stepping out of the car didn't seem interested in reason. Trent's posture was rigid, his hand hovering near his holstered gun, his face a mask of determination edged with something sharper: fear, maybe, or unchecked certainty. "Hands where I can see them," he snapped, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Clean's frown deepened, his mind racing to piece together the misunderstanding. He hadn't done anything, hadn't even jaywalked, yet the weight of the moment pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. "Officer, I think there's been a mistake," he said, his tone still even, though his chest tightened with a growing sense of dread. He could feel the situation slipping, the air crackling with tension he couldn't control. Trent advanced, his boots thudding against the pavement, his eyes boring into Clean with a focus that left no room for doubt. "I said, hands where I can see them." No. The command was louder this time, edged with a frantic energy that made Clean's pulse spike. He raised his hands slowly, the grocery bag slipping to the ground with a soft thud, the sordo tumbling out onto the sidewalk. His mind churned danger, frustration, and a bone-deep weariness warring within him. He'd spent his life upholding the law, protecting people, only to find himself on the other side of its jagged edge. "I'm a police officer," Clean said, his voice firm now, carrying the weight of his years of service. "Captain Clean, 4th Precinct." He locked eyes with Trent, willing him to hear, to understand. But Trent's gaze didn't waver, his hands still resting on his gun, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The words didn't land not the way they should have. To Trent, they were a dodge, a lie from a cornered suspect. His training screamed at him to stay dominant, to assume the worst, and his assumptions by a description and a lifetime of unexamined prejudice had already painted Clean as the enemy. "Nice try," he muttered, stepping closer, his fingers twitching against the holster. "Keep those hands up." Clean's jaw tightened, a flood of emotions crashing through him: disbelief that this was happening, fury at the injustice of it, and a quiet, aching sorrow for what it meant. He'd seen power abused before, had counseled rookies on the fine line between authority and arrogance, but to feel it turned against him, to stand helpless as his own truth was dismissed. Cut deeper than he'd ever imagined. The lesson was stark and brutal. Justice could falter, not just in the hands of the corrupt, but in the grip of the careless, the overzealous who let power blind them to the humanity in front of them. And the consequences, they rippled outward, eroding trust, fracturing lives, leaving scars that lingered long after the moment passed. On the sidewalk, the grocery bag lay abandoned, its contents scattered, a quiet testament to a night that should have been ordinary, now teetering on the edge of something far darker. The night air clung to the city streets, thick with the hum of distant traffic and the faint scent of rain that had fallen earlier in the day. Clean trudged along the sidewalk, his arms weighed down by grocery bags that crinkled with every step, his purse slung over his shoulder. He was exhausted not just from the long day at the precinct, but from the years he'd spent pouring his soul into a system he believed could change. As Captain Cleon Davis, he'd fought tooth and nail to rise through the ranks, a black man carving out a place in a world that often seemed determined to push him back. His badge was more than a piece of metal. It was a testament to his resilience, a symbol of trust he'd built with his team over countless late nights and hard-won victories. But in an instant, all of that would unravel. Officer Trent Oliver's patrol car had been idling at the corner, its headlights cutting through the dim street like a predator's gaze. Trent's day had been long too, a relentless string of calls that left him jaded, his patience worn thin. He'd heard every excuse in the book, sob stories, pleas of innocence, elaborate lies spun by people desperate to slip out of trouble. When he spotted Cleon, something in his mind clicked. The description from the robbery call earlier, vague as it was, seemed to match. Male, black, medium build. That was enough for Trent. He didn't hesitate, didn't question. With a muttered "yeah, right" under his breath, he stepped out of the car, his hand brushing the cuffs on his belt as he approached. Cleon barely had time to register the officer's presence before Trent was on him. The world tilted as Trent seized his arm with a grip like iron, spinning him around with a force that sent a jolt of shock through his body. His purse slipped from his shoulder, hitting the pavement with a dull thud, and the grocery bags followed, splitting open as apples rolled into the gutter and a carton of milk burst, pooling white against the cracked concrete. Cleon's heart lurched as Trent yanked his arms behind his back, the cold bite of steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists. The sensation was sharp, a Lena violation that sent a surge of disbelief and fury racing through his veins. "Officer, this is a mistake," Cleon's voice broke through the night, rising with a mix of frustration and desperation as he twisted against the restraints. "My badge is in my purse, Captain Cleon. You've got the wrong person." But his words fell on deaf ears. Trent's face was a mask of determination, his eyes narrowed with the tunnel vision of a man who'd already made up his mind. To him, this was routine, a suspect resisting, spinning a story. He'd seen it all before, or so he thought. With a firm hand on Cleon's elbow, he steered him toward the squad car, oblivious to the scattered groceries, the spilled milk soaking into the sidewalk, the raw anger building in Cleon's chest like a fire ready to erupt. Inside Cleon's mind, a storm was brewing, his pulse hammered in his ears, each beat a reminder of the absurdity unfolding around him. How could this be happening? He'd spent over a decade forging bonds with officers like Trentman and women he'd trained, mentored, stood beside in moments of crisis. He'd earned their respect, hadn't he? Yet here he was, reduced to nothing more than a figure in handcuffs, his rank and identity erased by the snap of metal and the weight of assumption. As Trent shoved him into the back seat of the squad car, the door slamming shut with a hollow clang, Cleon felt the sting of humiliation sink deep into his bones. The city lights streaked past the window in a blur of red and gold, but all he could see was the betrayal of a system he'd devoted his life to, a system that, in this moment, didn't care who he was. The street wasn't empty. Pedestrians slowed their steps, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of phone screens as they began to record. To them, it was a familiar scene, a white cop, a black man in cuffs, the flashing lights of a patrol car painting the night in shades of authority. Whispers rippled through the small crowd, some outraged, some resigned as the weight of history hung heavy in the air. Cleon could feel their stares boring into him, each one a needle pricking at his pride. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was a tableau of something far bigger, a wound that refused to heal. His chest tightened with a mix of shame and defiance. He wanted to scream, to demand they see him for who he was, but the cuffs held him silent, a prisoner in a narrative he'd spent his career trying to rewrite. Trent, meanwhile, was oblivious to the gathering storm. His mind was already ticking through the next steps. Secure the suspect, radio it in, move on. Suspect in custody, he said into the radio, his voice steady, almost proud. As he pulled away from the curb, the faint wail of sirens echoed behind them, a sound that usually signaled order, justice, to Trent. This was Justice Seclian, simple, by the book. He didn't glance back at Clean, didn't register the man's rigid posture or the fury simmering in his dark eyes. In Trent's world, he'd done his job. The truth, muddied as it was, didn't matter yet. For Clean, the ride to the precinct was an eternity compressed into minutes. Each bump in the road jostled his cuffed hands, the soreness in his wrists a constant reminder of his powerlessness. He stared out at the city he'd sworn to protect, its lights now a mocking kaleidoscope of a life he'd thought he understood. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a reckoning. The system he'd believed in, the one he'd fought to make fairer, had turned on him without a second thought. It stripped away his title, his dignity, and left him raw, exposed. A man caught in the gears of a machine he could no longer trust. The precinct's holding cell was a stark, unforgiving place. The cold steel bench beneath Clean seemed to leach the warmth from his body, amplifying the chill of disbelief that gripped him. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzzed like a swarm of restless insects, casting a harsh, clinical glow over the gray cinder block walls. The room felt smaller with every breath, as if it were shrinking to match the suffocating weight of his thoughts. His hands, finally free of the cuffs, rested in his lap, the red marks on his wrists throbbing faintly as he rubbed them. But the physical ache was nothing compared to the tumult in his mind. Over and over, he replayed the moment Trent had grabbed him, the dismissive sneer, the refusal to listen, the ease with which his identity had been discarded. Captain Clean Davis, a man who'd faced down chaos and prejudice to earn his place, now sat here, a prisoner in his own precinct. The holding area was quiet, save for the occasional shuffle of footsteps as officers passed by. Some glanced his way, their expressions flickering with confusion or a fleeting trace of pity. But none lingered. The air crackled with an unspoken tension, a collective awareness that something had gone terribly wrong. Clean's pulse still raced, though he forced his breathing to steady. He couldn't let the anger take over, not yet. He'd always been the calm one, the anchor in a storm. And even now, with his pride trampled and his faith shaken, he clung to that control. But beneath it, the fury simmered, a tidal wave held back by sheer will. This wasn't just personal. It was a glaring spotlight on the flaws he'd spent years trying to fix, flaws that had now ensnared him. The door to the intake room creaked open, and Officer Nina Patel stepped inside, her presence a sudden shift in the sterile stillness. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, but her face betrayed a tangle of emotions, concern, disbelief, a flicker of guilt. She scanned the room, her gaze landing on Clean behind the bars, and for a moment, she froze. Her hand hovered over the door handle, fingers trembling slightly as she processed the sight of her captain, her mentor, in a holding cell. Captain Davis, her voice was soft, tentative, as if she hoped saying his name might undo the reality before her. What in the world is going on? Clean rose to his feet, brushing off his sweatshirt in a gesture that felt more like reclaiming a shred of dignity than anything practical. "You tell me, officer," he replied, his tone cool but edged with a sharpness that cut through the room. "One of your colleagues just arrested me." Officer Trent decided I fit the description of a robbery suspect. Nina's face drained of color, her eyes widening as the weight of his words sank in. She fumbled with the keys on her belt, her movements hurried and unsteady as she unlocked the cell door and stepped inside. "To had no idea," she stammered, her voice thick with apology. "This has to be a mistake." "It is a mistake," Clean said, his words deliberate, each one heavy with restraint. "But it's more than that, Nina. It's a failure of judgment, of training, of everything this department is supposed to stand for. And right now, It's making us look like fools." Nina bit her lip, her gaze darting toward the door as if she could summon someone to fix this nightmare. "I'm so sorry, Captain. Let me get you out of here. I'll handle this immediately." Cleon didn't argue. He stepped out of the cell, his shoulders squared, his face a mask of composure that hid the chaos within. As they walked down the precinct's dimly lit hallway toward his office, the silence was oppressive. The few officers still at their desks glanced up, sensing the undercurrent of unease. But no one spoke. Nina closed the office door behind them, her hands trembling slightly as she turned to face him. Cleon sank into his chair, the familiar creak of the leather a faint anchor in the storm. He looked at Niniang, earnest. One of the officers he'd taken under his wing and saw the weight of this moment. Reflected in her eyes. "We'll sort this out," she promised, though her voice wavered. "Trent will answer for this." But Cleon's thoughts were already elsewhere. This wasn't just about Trent's mistake. It was about power wielded without question, justice twisted by haste and bias. He'd seen it claim others too many others, but to feel it himself was a wound that cut deeper than he'd ever imagined. The lesson was brutal. No rank, no service, no sacrifice could shield him from a system that too often saw only skin, not soul. And as the consequences of Trent's actions rippled outward, Cleon knew this was only the beginning, a spark that would ignite questions, confrontations, and a reckoning long overdue. The air in the precinct felt thick and stifling as Na stood before Captain Cleon David, her face still burning with a deep, crimson flush of embarrassment. Her hands fidgeted nervously at her sides, fingers twisting together as she struggled to find the right words. "Captain, I swear to you, we had no clue it was you," she stammered, her voice trembling slightly under the weight of her own discomfort. "Officer Trenthy didn't even hesitate, didn't think twice about recognizing you. He genuinely believed he was following protocol. There was a suspect description from dispatch, and he acted on it, thinking he was doing his job." Her eyes darted to the floor, unable to meet the piercing stare Cleon leveled at her. Cleon leaned forward slightly in his chair, one eyebrow arching sharply as though her words had struck a nerve deep within him. His gaze was like a blade, cutting through the haze of her excuses. "He doesn't know yet?" he asked, his tone laced with a bitter edge of incredulity. "After all this time on the force, he still doesn't recognize his own captain?" The question hung in the air, heavy and accusing, as though daring her to justify the absurdity of it. Na swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to breathe. "Don't think he did." "Captain," she managed to choke out, her voice barely above a whisper. He was so caught up in the moment, so sure he was just doing what he was trained to do. She winced inwardly, knowing how weak her explanation sounded, how it failed to soften the sting of what had happened. Cleon's jaw clenched tight, the muscles twitching as he fought to keep his composure. His hands rested on the arms of his chair, fingers curling slightly as if gripping onto his fading patience. "He didn't even listen," he said, his voice dropping to a chilling calm that sent a shiver down Na's spine. "I told him who I was over and over again and he didn't care. That's the real problem here, Nina." He paused, letting the silence amplify the weight of his words. "It's not just about him mistaking me for someone else. It's about what he saw when he looked at me. A black man in a sweatshirt and jaunts. That's all it took for him to decide I was a criminal. Nothing else mattered." Na flinched as the truth of his statement sank in, sharp and undeniable. She could feel the shame creeping up her neck, hot and suffocating. "I'll make sure Officer Trent knows he messed up, Captain," she said quickly, desperate to salvage something from the wreckage of this moment. "I'll drag him in here myself to apologize right now, if you want." Cleon's eyes narrowed, dark and unyielding, as he studied her with a look that made her feel small. "This isn't about an apology, officer," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "You think a few sorry words are going to fix this. This is bigger than that. This is about a system rotten with bias and prejudice things we've been fighting to rip out of this department for years. And yet, here we are, still drowning in it." His words carried the weight of exhaustion, of a man who had seen too much and carried too many scars from battles fought in silence. Nina nodded, her head dipping as a wave of chastened understanding washed over her. She straightened her posture, trying to project determination despite the turmoil swirling in her chest. "I get it, Captain," she said softly. "I'll start the internal review process today. We'll dig into this thoroughly. I promise you that." Cleon let out a slow, weary sigh as he leaned back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders giving way to a bone-deep fatigue that seemed to settle over him, like a heavy cloak. "Good," he said, his voice quieter now but no less commanding. "But don't think this ends with some paperwork and a slap on the wrist, Nina. What happened to me's a symptom of something festering in this department, in this whole damn system. This needs to shake us awake, force us to look at ourselves and what we've let slide for too long." His eyes drifted to the window, staring out at the gray sky beyond, as though searching for answers that refused to come. Nina gave a solemn nod, her expression hardening with resolve. But before she could respond, the door to Cleon's office burst open with a jarring creak, shattering the fragile tension in the room. Officer Vincent Brooks stumbled in, his face drained of color, his white eyes brimming with a chaotic mix of confusion and dread. "Captain David," he blurted, his voice quaking as he struggled to steady himself. "Didn't know. I swear on everything, I didn't realize it was you." His hands trembled at his sides, and he took a hesitant step forward, as if unsure whether he was welcome in this space. Cleon swiveled his chair to face Vincent fully, his expression a mask of stony calm that betrayed nothing of the storm raging inside him. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply letting the silence stretch between them like a taut wire. He watched as Vincent squirmed under the scrutiny, the younger officer's face a canvas of guilt and fear. Cleon could see it all, panic in his darting eyes, the flush of shame creeping up his neck, and part of him wanted to soften, to let Vincent off with a gentle reprimand and call it a misunderstanding. But he knew that wasn't justice. That wasn't the lesson this moment demanded. "Officer Brooks," Cleon began at last, his voice steady but edged with an unyielding authority that made Vincent flinch. "You put me in handcuffs without so much as glancing at my ID. I told you repeatedly who I was, and you brushed it off like it was nothing. You saw a vague description from dispatch, and that was enough for you to assume I was guilty." His words were deliberate, each one landing like a stone, building a wall of accountability Vincent couldn't escape. Vincent's eyes flickered with desperation, his breath hitching as he scrambled for a defense. "Captain, I was just going by what dispatch said," he pleaded, his voice rising with a frantic edge. "You match the description perfectly, height, build, clothes, and I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting people." His hands twitched nervously, as though itching to gesture, to somehow undo the mess he'd made. Cleon's jaw tightened again, a flicker of anger breaking through his calm facade. "The right thing?" he echoed, his tone sharp enough to cut. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk as he pinned Vincent with a look that demanded reckoning. "The right thing would have been to stop for half a damn second and listen to me. The right thing would have been to ask for my ID before you decided to slap cuffs on me and drag me in like some common thug. But no, you saw what you wanted to see, and you acted on it without a shred of doubt." Vincent's mouth opened, then closed, his lips trembling as he groped for words that wouldn't come. His face flushed a deep, mottled red, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides, nails digging into his palms. "I'm sorry, Captain," he finally managed, his voice cracking under the strain. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to disrespect Yowie, didn't mean for any of this to happen." His eyes glistened with unshed tears, the weight of his shame pressing down on him like a physical force. Cleon's gaze softened, just for a moment, a flicker of empathy breaking through the steel in his expression. "I'm sure you didn't," he said, his voice losing some of its edge but retaining its gravity. "But what you meant doesn't change what you did. This isn't just about me, Vincent. This is about how we carry ourselves as officers, show we treat the people we're sworn to protect. If you couldn't hear me, your own captain, when I told you who I was, what does that say about how you handle the folks out there on the street every day?" Vincent blinked rapidly, his breath catching as Cleon's words sank deeper, peeling back layers of certainty he'd clung to in the heat of the moment. He could still feel the adrenaline coursing through him from the arrest rush of authority, the certainty that he was in control. But now, standing here, that certainty crumbled into dust. He saw it clearly. He'd been wrong, terribly wrong, and the realization hollowed him out. His shoulders slumped, his defensive posture melting into something raw and vulnerable as the full scope of his mistake. settled over him. Clean didn't relent, though his tone remained measured, deliberate. "You didn't see a person out there, Vincent," he said, his voice low and resonant. "You saw a threat. You made up your mind before you even gave me a chance to speak. That's not just a mistake, it's a failure. And it's not just your failure. It's a crack in the foundation of this whole department, this whole system we're part of." He leaned back again, folding his arms across his chest as he let his words linger, heavy and unescapable. Vincent stood frozen, his head bowed, the fight drained out of him. He had no rebuttal, no excuse left to offer. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in as the gravity of his actions pressed down on him. He'd always prided himself on being a good cop, quick, decisive, fearless, but now he saw the shadow behind that pride, recklessness, assumption, prejudice he hadn't even known he carried. Nina, who had been watching the exchange with a tightness in her chest, stepped forward, her boots scuffing softly against the worn linoleum floor. "Captain," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her eyes, "I'll make sure Officer Brooks goes through a full review. And I'm recommending mandatory training for everyone, racial bias, proper procedure, all of it. We can't let this slide." Clean nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead, tracing the threads of this incident to the larger tapestry of flaws he'd spent years trying to mend. "That's a start," he said, his tone firm. "But it's not enough to just train people and call it a day. We need accountability consequences for screwing up like this. Otherwise, we're just slapping a Band-Aid on a gaping wound and pretending it's healed. We'll be right back here again, Nina, and I'm tired of running in circles." Vincent lifted his head slightly, his pale face etched with a dawning comprehension. "I understand, Captain," he said quietly, his voice barely audible but laced with a sincerity that hadn't been there before. With a curt wave of Clean's hand, Vincent turned and shuffled out of the office, his footsteps heavy and slow, as though each one carried the weight of his regret. Nina lingered, her posture rigid with tension. "Captain, I'm so sorry this happened," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We'll fix this, I swear we will," her hands clenched at her sides, determination burning in her eyes despite the exhaustion creeping into her frame. Clean gave her a tired nod, the heaviness in his chest unrelenting. "See that we do, Nina," he said softly. "See that we do." His gaze drifted back to the window, the world outside blurred by the weight of his thoughts. Word of the incident spread through the precinct like a wildfire tearing through dry brush, unstoppable and all-consuming. By the time Clean stepped out of his office, the air buzzed with hushed whispers and sit-along glances. Officers hunched over desks froze mid-task, their pens hovering above reports as their heads turned toward him. Conversations died abruptly, replaced by an electric silence that crackled with curiosity and unease. Eyes followed him as he moved through the corridor, some wide with disbelief, others narrowed with pity or suspicion. The atmosphere shifted palpably, thick with the unspoken tension of a scandal unfolding in real time. Clean felt the weight of those stares boring into him, each one a pinprick against his already bruised pride. He'd been in the spotlight before, commended for bravery, celebrated for cracking tough cases, but this was different. This wasn't the warm glow of recognition. It was a harsh, unforgiving glare that stripped him bare. The humiliation simmered beneath his skin, a slow burn he couldn't shake. Being hauled into a holding cell by one of his own wasn't just a personal slight, it was a public wound, raw and exposed, and he knew it would ripple far beyond these walls. The murmurs followed him like a shadow, faint but persistent. "Did you hear? Officer Trent arrested Captain David. Thought he was some suspect." "No way, Captain David. How do you even mess that up? Trent's done for, man. This is gonna blow up big time. You think they'll fire him over this?" The voices wove together into a chorus of gossip and speculation, each word stoking the fire of Clean's frustration. He kept his head high, his stride purposeful, refusing to let them see the cracks beneath his armor. But inside, the lesson burned clear. Justice wasn't just about catching the guilty, it was about seeing people for who they were, not what power or prejudice painted them to be. And the cost of forgetting, that was a reckoning none of them could escape. The noise of the precinct faded into a dull hum as Clean stood motionless on the steps, his mind no longer tethered to the meaningless chatter swirling around him. His focus had shifted, zooming out to a wider, more troubling vista that stretched beyond the walls of the station he'd poured his life into. For years, he'd prided himself on his ability to keep his emotions locked tight, a fortress of discipline built brick by brick through sheer will. But now, the weight of everything pressed against that fortress like a battering ram, threatening to crack its foundation. The department he'd sworn to serve, the institution he'd believed in with every fiber of his being, stood at a perilous fork in the road. One path led to redemption, the other to ruin. And Cleon knew he couldn't let the storm raging inside him blur his vision. What had happened to him wasn't just a personal wound, it was a glaring symptom of a sickness that pulsed through the arteries of not only his precinct, but the entire sprawling body of law enforcement. Justice, he'd always thought, was the heartbeat of his work. Yet now, it felt like that heartbeat was faltering, corrupted by the very hands meant to sustain it. Stepping outside, the evening air slapped his face with a sharp, icy sting, yanking him from the spiral of his thoughts. The distant rumble of traffic rolled through the city like a restless tide, a stark counterpoint to the heavy stillness that cloaked the precinct's entrance. For a fleeting moment, Cleon let himself just stand there, rooted to the cold stone steps, his dark eyes sweeping the street below. This place, this building, had been more than a job. It was his sanctuary, his second home. He'd walked through its doors every day with purpose, believing he held real power to shift the tides, to carve out something better for the people he'd sworn to protect. But after today, that belief felt like a distant echo. The precinct loomed behind him, its shadow stretching long and unfamiliar, as if it had morphed into a stranger's halcyon where he no longer belonged. The betrayal stung deeper than he'd expected, a quiet ache that gnawed at the edges of his resolve. A sudden buzz in his pocket jolted him back to the present. Fishing out his phone, his thumb brushed the screen with practiced ease, revealing a text from Jackson Cole, a fellow officer whose steady presence had always been a comfort. "You okay?" it read, simple yet loaded with unspoken concern. Cleon's chest tightened. He hadn't had a chance to unpack the chaos of the day with Jackson, hadn't found the words to bridge the gap between what had happened and how it felt. How could he? How could he distill the raw humiliation of being shackled by one of his own, a brother in blue, into something coherent? The moment replayed in his mind, the cold bite of handcuffs snapping shut, the sudden stripping away of his authority, his dignity, all in the blink of an eye. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating, before tapping out a vague reply. "I'm fine. Heading home soon." Long day. It was a lie dressed up as truth, a flimsy shield against the questions he wasn't ready to face. Slipping the phone back into his coat, he exhaled, his breath curling into the chilly air like a ghost of his frustration. Movement caught his eye down the street, a small knot of people clustered at the corner, their faces bathed in the eerie glow of their phone screens. Some held their devices aloft, lenses pointed like silent sentinels. It took a beat for the realization to sink in. They were watching the precinct. Now they were watching him, recording him, snapping photos. A fresh wave of anger surged through his veins, hot and bitter. Word had spread like wildfire, fueled by a bystander's shaky footage of his arrest video that had already exploded across the internet. He hadn't even had time to wrap his head around the incident, to sift through its jagged pieces. And now it was out there, spiraling beyond his grasp. That clip, blurry and disjointed, would be the public's first taste of the story, not the truth, not the context, but a fractured snapshot shaped by strangers' captions and half-baked takes. He could already hear the headlines screaming in his mind. Black female police captain wrongly arrested by white officer. It was the kind of story that fed the beast of outrage, slotting neatly into the festering narrative of racial bias that shadowed policing like a dark cloud. Cleon hated how it twisted his pain into a spectacle, but he couldn't deny the truth at its crethus was bigger than him now, a glaring spotlight on the flaws he'd spent his career battling. His thoughts churned, racing back to the call he'd gotten earlier from the chief. The voicemail had been a clumsy mix of regret and desperation. The chief's voice tight with unease. "We'll handle this, Cleon. We can't let it spiral out of control. Let's keep it quiet. Stay united. United." The word tasted sour. Brushing this under the rug wouldn't fix the roti, would let it spread. If he stayed silent, if he didn't demand answers, what would that say to his team? To the community he'd vowed to serve? The image of himself in cuffs, helpless on the pavement, was now a public emblem of everything he'd fought against: unchecked bias, racial profiling, the slow poison of a broken system. Justice wasn't just a word to Clean, it was the fire that had driven him up the ranks. A black woman carving her place in a world that often tried to shut her out. But now, that fire flickered, threatened by the very institution he'd trusted. Another vibration snapped him out of his reverie. This time, it was the department's PR office. Their message curt and urgent: "We need to talk about the press. Call me ASAP." Clean's jaw tightened, his frustration boiling over. Of course, if press, the department would want to wrestle the story into something palatable. A polished lie draped in vague apologies and empty platitudes. Mistakes were made, they'd say, smoothing over the ugly truth without ever digging into it. He let out a heavy sigh, his breath fogging in the crisp air. There was no clean escape from this, no quick fix to stitch the wound shut. Protests were inevitably, could feel it in his bones. That viral video would ignite a firestorm, not just among the usual skeptics, but among those who'd once seen him as a beacon of hope, a sign that the system could change. His rise to captain had meant something, a triumph, a crack in the old walls. Now, this mess threatened to crumble it all. As he started down the steps, a flicker of light caught his eye. Reporters. They swarmed at the edge of the sidewalk, penned in by flimsy barricades thrown up to hold back the growing crowd. Cameras flashed like gunfire, microphones jabbed forward, and voices collided in a frantic chorus. "Captain David, any comment on your wrongful arrest? Was this racially motivated? What does this say about the department?" Clean froze, his body coiled with tension. He hadn't braced himself for this ambush, not so soon, but he should have known. The press smelled blood, and he was the story of the hour. The temptation to speak burned in his throat. To step into the spotlight and lay bare the raw, unfiltered truth. Yet he also knew one misstep, one poorly chosen word, could set the whole thing ablaze. Before he could decide, a hand grazed his shoulder. He turned to see Nina, his assistant, rushing toward him, her face etched with worry. "Captain, we've got to get you inside. This is blowing up fast." Clean gave a sharp nod, his gaze lingering on the flashing cameras as Nina steered him back toward the precinct doors. The reporters' shouts chased after him, their voices clawing at the air until the heavy doors thudded shut, muffling the chaos inside. Nina spun to face him, her hands twisting nervously. "The chief's in with the mayor right now. They're scrambling to figure out how to spin this. And there's already a protest kicking off outside." Clean rubbed his temple, the pressure building like a vice around his skull. "Of course there is," he muttered, his voice low and weary. Nina hesitated, then pressed on. "They're worried higher-ups. This could turn into a full-blown scandal. They're talking about a statement soon, but they want your input first." A sharp laugh escaped Clean's lips, bitter and jagged. "My input? Now they want my input? After I've been humiliated in front of every onifter, they've made me a poster child for everything wrong with this place." His anger flared, hot and unrestrained, fueled by the absurdity of it all. Nina flinched, but didn't back down, her eyes flickering with a mix of sympathy and resolve. "I know, Captain, it's a mess, but they're scared. This isn't just about you, it's about what you represent. And what happens next, that's on all of us." Her words hung heavy, a quiet plea woven into the tension. Clean's fists clenched at his sides, the lessons of justice and the consequences of power's abuse crashing through his mind. This wasn't just his fight anymore, it was a reckoning, one that would either heal the wounds or tear them wider. And as the distant chants of protesters seeped through the walls, he knew the choice was his to make. In the dimly lit corridor of the precinct, Nina Patel shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her unease palpable in the way her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her uniform. The air between her and Captain Clean crackled with tension, thick and heavy, as if the walls themselves held their breath. She searched for words, her mind racing to find a way to bridge the chasm growing between them. "Captain," she began, her voice tentative, almost fragile. "They're just trying to stop this from spiraling into chaos. They're scared of what might happen if it all falls apart." Her eyes darted to his, hoping for some flicker of understanding, but Cleon's gaze sharpened, his brows knitting together in a storm of defiance. "Chaos?" he shot back, his voice low but edged with a fire that made Nina flinch inwardly. "Maybe chaos is exactly what we need. Maybe that's the only thing that'll shake this place awake. You think anything's going to change if we keep tiptoeing around the truth?" His words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding, daring her to argue. For a moment, they stood locked in a silent standoff, the weight of their shared history and the fractured state of their department pressing down on them like a physical force. Nina's chest tightened. She could feel the pulse of her own heartbeat in her throat. She wanted to reach out, to soften the blow of his anger, but the distance between them felt insurmountable. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice dropping to a near whisper, as though speaking too loudly might shatter something fragile. "Look, Cleon, I get it. What happened to you, it's beyond messed up. It's unfair, and it's wrong. The chief, though, he's just trying to keep this from exploding into something we can't control. He's clinging to the idea of peace." She paused, her eyes flickering toward the door, half expecting someone to barge in and relieve her of this burden. Cleon let out a bitter snort, the sound cutting through the quiet like a blade. "Peace? There's no peace here, Nina. This place has been a ticking time bomb for years. Severi, one of us knows it. I'm not here to play nice and pretend everything's fine. I'm here to fix what's broken." Nina swallowed hard, her throat dry as her gaze darted toward the exit again, a silent plea for rescue that never came. She admired Cleon, his strength, his resolve, but his words stirred a deep unease in her. "So, what's your plan then?" she asked, her tone laced with both curiosity and dread. Cleon didn't hesitate, his response immediate and unwavering. "I want accountability. I want the truth laid bare for everyone to see, a public reckoning of what went wrong. And I want Officer Trent, and anyone else who had a hand in this, to face real consequences. Not some meaningless reprimand, Nina Justice." His voice rang with conviction, each syllable a hammer striking steel. Nina nodded slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line as worry clouded her dark eyes. She understood his demand, even felt the righteousness in it. But the reality of what he was asking loomed like a storm on the horizon. "I'll take it to the chief," she said, her words measured, "but you know this won't be simple. There are people above us, people with power will fight tooth and nail to keep this quiet. They'll see it as a threat." Cleon straightened, his broad shoulders squaring as if preparing for battle. "It's already a threat, Nina," he replied, his tone resolute, "and I'm not letting it fade away." With that, he turned on his heel, his boots echoing against the tiled floor as he strode down the hallway, leaving Nina rooted to the spot, her mind a tangle of doubt and admiration. She watched him go, knowing the road ahead would be a war of wills, and Cleon scarred, but unbowed, was ready to fight it. Farther down the precinct, in the shadowed confines of the locker room, Officer Trent slumped against the cold steel of his locker, his head cradled in trembling hands. The distant clamor of the station phones ringing, officers shouting orders. The shuffle of paperwork faded into a dull hum, as if the world beyond had slipped out of reach. Inside his skull, though, the silence roared, a relentless echo of his own failure. Over and over, he replayed the moment that had unraveled his life, the flash of gray sweatshirt, the dark jeans, the woman standing before him on that rain-slicked street. His training had surged to the forefront, muscle memory overriding thought. She matched the description: black female, mid-30s, casual clothes. That was enough. It had to be enough. His breath hitched as the memory sharpened. He'd barked orders, his voice steady with authority, cuffs clicking into place with practiced ease. She'd protested, her words sharp and insistent: "I'm Captain Cleon." But he'd dismissed it as a desperate lie. Suspects always talked their way out. He'd seen it 100 times. How could he have known? How could he have been so blind? The truth crashed over him like a wave, each realization more suffocating than the last. He hadn't just arrested a civilian. He'd handcuffed his own captain, a man who towered over him in rank, in experience, in every way that mattered. Captain Cleon, with his steady gaze and unshakable moral compass. A leader who'd spent years pushing for change in a system riddled with cracks. And Trent had humiliated him, reduced him to a suspect on a public street. He lifted his head, staring at his shaking hands as if they belonged to someone else. The tremors wouldn't stop. Fear, shame, adrenaline, all churning together in a sickening brew. The locker room, once a sanctuary of laughter and camaraderie, now closed in around him. The air thick and oppressive, footsteps approached, and the door swung open with a groan. Trent's body tensed, his eyes snapping to the figure in the doorway. Nina Patel stepped inside, her face a mask of grim determination, her posture rigid with purpose. "Trent," she said, her voice low and taut, slicing through the haze in his mind. "We need to talk." He stood on unsteady legs, his stomach lurching as he met her gaze. He wasn't ready yet for her words, not for the judgment he knew was coming, but there was no escape. She motioned for him to follow, and he trailed behind her in silence, his heart hammering against his ribs. They passed through the bustling bullpen, where officers hunched over desks, their pens scratching against forms, their voices a steady drone. A few heads turned, eyes lingering on Trent with a mix of curiosity and pity. No one spoke, but the silence was louder than any accusation. He felt exposed, flayed open for all to see, his mistake now the precinct's whispered legend. Nina led him to a small conference room, the door clicking shut behind them with a finality that made him flinch. The space was sparsely scratched table, a handful of chairs, but it felt like a cage, the walls pressing in as he sank into a seat. His hands gripped his knees, knuckles white, as his mind raced with 1,000 what-ifs. Nina stood for a moment, arms crossed, her dark eyes boring into him with an intensity that made him shrink. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until she finally spoke, her voice calm but laced with a razor's edge. "Do you even realize how bad this looks?" Trent's throat tightened, his voice barely a rasp. "I know, officer. I didn't mean for it to happen." He swear. Nina exhaled sharply, her hands falling to her sides as frustration flashed across her face. "Whether you meant it or not doesn't matter, Trent. It happened. You wrested Captain Cleanone of us, a captain. Do you grasp how massive that is?" He nodded, the gesture feeble against the weight of her words. "I thought I was doing my job." He stammered, the description fit: gray sweatshirt, dark jeans. "I thought Shehu was the suspect." Nina's voice rose, incredulous. "The description fit, that's it. A vague match, and you jump straight to guilt. You didn't even check his ID, did you?" Shame burned through him, his face flushing as he shook his head. "No, I thought he was stalling, trying to talk his way out. I've seen it before." Her expression hardened, her eyes narrowing. "Stalling. He told you he was Captain Clean, Trent. You didn't listen. You didn't even pause to think he might be telling the truth." He dropped his gaze to the table, the grain of the wood blurring as regret clawed at him. He couldn't face her, not her anger, not her disappointment. Nina pulled out a chair and sat across from him, leaning forward, her voice softening but still firm. "This isn't just a mistake, Trent. It's bigger than that. You saw a black man in a sweatshirt and decided he was guilty. No questions, no hesitation, just instinct. And your instinct failed you. It failed all of us." Her words cut deep, piercing the pride he'd once held as a shield. He'd always seen himself as a good cop, diligent, fair, by the book. Now that image lay in ruins, and the lesson was brutal. Justice demanded more than blind action. It demanded thought, restraint, accountability. Clean's fight wasn't just his own, it was a mirror held up to the department, reflecting every flaw, every abuse of power, and Trent, whether he'd meant to or not, had become its living proof. The consequences would ripple far beyond that rainy street, and he knew, with a sinking dread, that there was no turning back. Trent Oliver stood in the dimly lit conference room, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his uniform, the fabric creasing under the pressure of his clenched fists. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on him, amplifying the weight of the moment. He couldn't meet Nina's gaze yet. Her sharp, unwavering eyes bore into him, and he could feel the heat of her disappointment radiating across the scratched wooden table that separated them. He wanted to speak, to explain himself, but the words caught in his throat like jagged stones. "I didn't mean to," he finally managed, his voice low and trembling, barely audible over the hum of the precinct's air conditioning. Nina didn't let him finish. She leaned forward, her chair creaking under the shift of her weight, and cut through his feeble defense with the precision of a blade. "I know you didn't mean to, Trent," she said, her tone firm but laced with an undercurrent of exhaustion. But that's exactly the problem. This isn't about what you intended, it's about what you did. And what you did has consequences that ripple far beyond this room. Her words landed like a punch to his gut, forcing him to confront the reality he'd been dodging. Captain Clean is one of the most respected men in this department. He's earned that respect through years of dedication. And you treated him like some common thug off the street. Do you even realize what that says to everyone else? Trent shook his head, the motion slow and heavy, as if his neck could barely support the burden of his thoughts. Her accusation settled over him like a damp fog, cold and inescapable. I didn't think, he mumbled, his voice trailing off into the void of his own regret. He hadn't thought not about Clean, not about the department, not about anything beyond the adrenaline pumping through his veins in that chaotic moment. On the street, now, that oversight felt like a noose tightening around his neck. You didn't think, Nina snapped, her voice rising with a sharpness that made Trent flinch. And now we're all stuck cleaning up the mess you made. She leaned back in her chair, the squeak of the springs punctuating her frustration. This isn't just about you anymore, Trent. Your actions dragged the entire precinct into this storm, and the fallout's only just starting. Her words stung like salt in an open wound, but deep down, Trent knew she was right. He could feel the truth of it sinking into his bones, a bitter realization that his mistake had fractured something much larger than himself. Nina sighed, the sound heavy with resignation, and rubbed a hand across her forehead. That arrest you made, it's already everywhere. The video's gone viral, millions of views on social media in just hours. There are protests forming outside the precinct as we speak. People are furious, Trent, and they've got every damn right to be. Her voice softened slightly, but the gravity remained, pressing down on him like a physical force. Trent's heart plummeted, a sickening lurch that left him dizzy. He'd known there were bystanders on that crowded street corner, their phones raised like silent witnesses, but he hadn't grasped how fast the footage would spread or how devastating it would be. To see his error replayed endlessly online, the thought of strangers across the city, maybe even the country, watching him slam Captain Clean against the hood of a patrol car, made his stomach twist into knots. He could still hear the metallic clank of the cuffs, the muffled protests from Clean that he'd dismissed as resistance. Now, those sounds haunted him, echoing in his mind like a relentless accusation. What's going to happen now? He asked, his voice barely a whisper, fragile and small in the vastness of his uncertainty. He looked up at Nina, searching her face for some hint of reassurance, but her expression was unreadable, her dark eyes studying him with a mix of pity and resolve. She paused, letting the silence stretch between them, before answering. The chief's locked in a meeting with the mayor right now, trying to figure out how to spin this disaster. But I'll be honest, it doesn't look good for you. They're tossing around words like suspension or even termination. She let the last word hang in the air, watching as the color drained from Trent's face. Termination. The possibility hit him like a freight train, stealing the breath from his lungs. He hadn't even considered it until that moment, but now it loomed over him, dark and inevitable. This wasn't some minor slip-up he could brush off with an apology and extra paperwork. He'd arrested his own captain, a man he'd looked up to, a man whose reputation he'd unwittingly tarnished, and now the department was scrambling to salvage its credibility. Trent's legs felt weak, and he gripped the edge of the table to steady himself, his knuckles whitening against the wood. Nina's gaze softened, just for a moment, as she watched him grapple with the enormity of his situation. Look, Trent, she said, her voice quieter now, almost gentle. I know you didn't set out to cause this chaos, but this is bigger than your intentions. The department has to respond publicly, decisively. They need to prove they're holding people accountable. And that means consequences are coming your way, whether you're ready for them or not. Trent nodded, a slow, mechanical motion, though his mind was a chaotic swirl of panic and disbelief. He'd clawed his way into this job-endless nights of training, grueling shifts, sacrifices he couldn't even count, and now it was all teetering on the edge of collapse because of one reckless decision. I understand, he said, the words tasting hollow and bitter on his tongue. Nina stood, her chair scraping loudly against the worn linoleum floor, the sound jarring in the stillness. For what it's worth, "I don't think you're a bad cop," she said, her tone measured but sincere. "But you've got to start really thinking about what you do out there. This job isn't just about chasing down suspects. It's about the people you affect, the trust you uphold, the message you send. If you can't see that, then maybe this isn't where you belong." Her words sliced through him, sharp and unrelenting, exposing doubts he'd never dared to face. She left the room without another word, the door clicking shut behind her with a finality that echoed in Trent's chest. Alone now, he sank into a chair, his elbows resting on the table, his head dropping into his hands. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. Guilt gnawed at him, a relentless ache that twisted his insides. Shame burned in his throat, and fear of losing everything he'd built clamped around his heart like a vice. He'd always seen himself as a good cop, someone who did the right thing, who protected and served. But now, staring at the scuffed tabletop, he wondered if he'd been wrong all along, if his instincts were flawed, if his judgment was tainted by something he couldn't even name. The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last, as Trent replayed Nina's words in his mind. The protests outside of chance he could faintly hear through the thick precinct walls grew louder, a chorus of anger and demand for justice that he'd ignited. The viral video, spreading like wildfire across the internet, was a mirror held up to his failure, and he couldn't escape the reflection. His future, once so certain, now felt like sand slipping through his fingers, and the helplessness of it all threatened to drown him. Eventually, he forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady beneath him, and made his way out of the room. The hallway stretched before him, lined with lockers and bulletin boards plastered with notices familiar sights that now felt alien, like he was trespassing in a world he no longer belonged to. Officers passed by, their glances flickering toward him, some with quiet sympathy, others with thinly veiled disdain. No one spoke, but their silence said enough. Trent kept his head down, his boots scuffing against the tile, until he reached the precinct's front doors. Stepping outside, he was hit by a rush of cool evening air, sharp against his flushed skin. The noise of the protest swelled, no longer muffled by waltz cacophony of raised voices, stomping feet, and the rustle of handmade signs swaying in the breeze. "Justice for Captain Clean," someone shouted, the cry picked up by dozens more. "No more police brutality. Hold them accountable." The words pounded against Trent's skull, each one a hammer strike to his fragile resolve. He stood on the precinct steps, frozen, watching the crowd swell before him, faces contorted with rage, eyes blazing with a righteousness he couldn't argue against. For the first time in his career, Trent wasn't the one behind the badge, the one standing firm against the chaos. He was on the other side, the target of their fury, the symbol of everything they despised. His chest tightened, his pulse thundering in his ears. As the reality sank in, he'd become the villain in a story he'd never meant to write. His career, his reputation, his sense of self, they were all unraveling, thread by thread, and he didn't know how to stop it. In that moment, with the city's anger roaring around him, Trent Oliver glimpsed the deeper truth. Justice wasn't just a badge he wore, it was a force that demanded accountability, even from him. Across the precinct, in a small office tucked away from the clamor, Captain Marcus Clean sat behind his desk, the door firmly shut against the world outside. The faint glow of his desk lamp spilled across the room, casting long, jagged shadows that danced along the walls, giving the space an almost ghostly stillness. Papers were scattered across his desk, reports he'd meant to finish hours ago. His hands rested idle, his pen abandoned beside a blank form. The blinking cursor on his computer screen mocked him, a silent reminder of the work he couldn't bring himself to do. His mind was elsewhere, tangled in the events of the past day, replaying them over and over until they blurred into a haze of exhaustion and disbelief. His body ached, a dull throb that pulsed through his shoulders and down his spine, the remnants of tension he'd carried since the moment Officer Trent Oliver had shoved him against that patrol car. The memory burned, it hit and bitter despite his efforts to push it down. The cold bite of handcuffs on his wrists, the rough scrape of asphalt under his boots, the sting of humiliation as onlookers gawked and recorded, it all lingered, a wound that refused to heal. Clean clenched his jaw, his teeth grinding together as he leaned back in his chair, staring up at the cracked ceiling tiles. He'd spent decades building his life around this department, pouring every ounce of himself into it. And yet here he was, betrayed by one of his own. As a black man in law enforcement, Cleon had always known the stakes were higher for him. He'd felt it from the start: the sit-along glances, the whispered doubts, the unspoken expectation that he'd have to prove himself twice over, just to stand shoulder to shoulder with his peers. He'd risen through the ranks with grit and determination: patrol officer, detective, sergeant, and finally captain. Each step had been a battle, each promotion a testament to his resilience. He'd faced down criminals, navigated politics, and fought for change within a system riddled with flaws he'd seen firsthand in the way. It treated people who looked like him. He'd believed he could make a difference, that his presence here mattered. And then Trent Oliver had reduced all of that to nothing with a single, thoughtless act. The betrayal cut deeper than the physical discomfort. Cleon had trained Trent, had seen potential in him, had taken him under his wing during those early, uncertain days on the force. He'd shared stories, offered advice, tried to instill in him the values of patience and discernment. And yet, on that bustling street corner, Trent hadn't hesitated, hadn't questioned, hadn't even recognized him. The younger officer's assumptions had overridden everything: Cleon's rank, his reputation, his humanity, leaving him to wonder if all his years of service had been for nothing. He closed his eyes, letting the darkness behind his lids swallow the room's faint light. The precinct had been his sanctuary, a place where he'd found purpose amid the chaos. He'd walked its halls with pride, his head high, knowing he was part of something bigger. Now, that pride felt tarnished, replaced by a hollow ache he couldn't shake. Outside, the protests raged on. Could hear the distant shouts through the thick walls, a reminder of the firestorm Trent had unleashed. Cleon didn't blame the crowd. Their anger was justified, their demand for justice a mirror to his own, but it didn't ease the weight pressing down on him. The lesson was clear, etched into every shadow of this quiet room: power, unchecked, could corrupt even the well-intentioned. Trent's mistake wasn't just a lapse in judgment, it was a symptom of a deeper rot, one Cleon had spent his career trying to uproot. Justice, he realized, wasn't a gift handed down, it was a debt owed, one that came due when those in power forgot their responsibility. For Trent, the consequences might mean a lost career. For Cleon, they meant a reckoning with the system, with his trust, with the fragile hope he'd clung to for so long. As the night stretched on, he sat there, the weight of it all anchoring him to his chair, wondering if the fight was still worth it. The air in Cleon's office hung heavy, thick with the bitter scent of stale coffee and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. He sat slumped in his chair, the worn leather creaking under his weight, his wrists still raw from the cold bite of the handcuffs that had clamped around them. Just a day ago, despite all his efforts, years spent pushing for diversity training, advocating for policies to curb racial profiling, and championing community policing to mend the fragile trust between the police force and the neighborhoods they swore to protect, had found himself shoved into the back of a squad car, treated like a common thug. The irony gnawed at him, a relentless ache that pulsed beneath his ribs. His phone buzzed sharply on the cluttered desk, snapping him out of the spiraling storm of his thoughts. He glanced down at the glowing screen, squinting against the harsh light. A text from Lydia Hayes, his partner in spirit if not in uniform, flickered into view. "How are you holding up? Everyone's talking about it at the station. Call me if you need to talk." Lydia's words carried a warmth that Cleon craved, but couldn't fully embrace. She worked across town as a firefighter, her station a stark contrast to the rigid, often suffocating world he inhabited, where Cleon wrestled daily with the tangled web of politics, unspoken biases, and the weight of a police force steeped in tradition historically dominated by white men, who guarded their power like a fortress. Lydia's crew was a tight-knit family. They laughed together over shared meals, leaned on each other during late-night calls, and wore their camaraderie like a badge of honor. Cleon envied that sense of belonging, though he'd never let the words slip past his lips. It was a quiet ache, a longing he buried beneath layers of stoicism. He wanted to tap out a reply, to tell her he was fine, that this was just a storm that would pass like so many before it. but the lie stuck in his throat. He wasn't fine. The humiliation, the betrayal, it clung to him like damp clothes after a rainstorm, chilling him to the bone. Could he really brush this off? Could he pretend it didn't carve a jagged line through everything he'd fought for? A sharp knock at the door shattered the silence, pulling him upright in his seat. He straightened his shoulders, shoving his roiling emotions down into the pit of his stomach. "Come in," he called, his voice steady despite the chaos within. The door swung open, and Chief Vincent Brooks stepped into the room, his presence filling the space like a thundercloud rolling over a clear sky. Vincent was a towering figure, broad-shouldered and solid, his once jet-black hair now threaded with silver, a testament to decades spent weathering the storms of law enforcement. His uniform was pristine, the gold stars on his collar catching the artificial light and glinting with quiet authority. Cleon had always held a grudging respect for the man. Vincent was old school, rooted in traditions Cleon often challenged, but he'd backed Cleon's push for reforms when others had scoffed. Today, though, there was a shadow in Vincent's eye, something guarded, heavy with unspoken weight. "Cleon," he said, his voice a low rumble, tinged with a somberness that set Cleon's nerves on edge. "We need to talk." Cleon gestured to the chair across his desk, a rickety thing with faded upholstery that groaned under Vincent's bulk as he settled into it. The chief closed the door with a soft click, sealing them into a bubble of tense silence. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them crackled with unvoiced questions, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Cleon's pulse thudded in his ears, a steady drumbeat of dread. He could feel the weight of what was coming, a conversation that would peel back the fragile scab of yesterday's wounds. Vincent broke the quiet first, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "I'm sure you know why I'm here," he said, his gaze locking onto Cleon's with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. Cleon nodded, slow and deliberate, his throat tight. "I figured." Vincent exhaled, a weary sound that seemed to carry the burden of years. "Look, Cleon, you know I respect you. I've watched you climb the ranks, seen the good you've done for this department, the changes you've fought for. They've made a difference. But what happened yesterday?" He trailed off, rubbing the back of his neck as if the words were too heavy to hold. It stirred up a mess. Cleon's stomach twisted, a cold knot forming deep inside. But he kept his expression blank, a mask honed by years of navigating this unforgiving world. "I'm aware," he said, his voice clipped. "The protests are still going strong outside." Vincent nodded, his jaw tightening. "And they're growing. The press is circling like vultures, and the mayor, he's furious. He's worried this is going to shred what's left of the public's trust in us." The mention of public trust sparked a bitter flare in Cleon's chest, hot and sharp. He nearly laughed, the sound catching in his throat like broken glass. Trust that had been crumbling long before yesterday, eroded by years of neglect, by a system that patched over its cracks instead of tearing them open to fix the rot beneath. This wasn't about one officer's mistake. It was the festering consequence of power wielded without accountability, of justice promised but rarely delivered. "Chief," Cleon said, his tone measured but edged with steel, "this isn't just about one slip-up. What happened yesterday, it's a symptom of something we've ignored for too damn long." Vincent's eyes narrowed, and for a fleeting moment, Cleon glimpsed the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. The chief had spent decades in this game, had seen scandals flare and fade, had wrestled with corruption and missteps. But this was different. This was a thread unraveling the whole tapestry. "I know," Vincent admitted, his voice dropping to a hushed, heavy whisper. "You think I don't see it. You think I haven't tried to change things." He leaned back, his shoulders slumping slightly as if the weight of his confession pressed him down. "This department's a machine, Cleon, a rusted, creaking thing. We've been plugging leaks for years, but every time we patch one, another bursts open. It's a fight I'm tired of fighting alone." Cleon's hands tightened on the edge of his desk, the wood biting into his palms. He understood the metaphor hell. He'd lived it, but understanding didn't dull the frustration boiling inside him. "Then why do we keep treating it like it's normal?" He shot back, his voice rising despite his efforts to keep it level. "We can't just bury this and hope it fades. People are angry, Chief. They're hurting, and they've got every right to be. Vincent's expression hardened, but his tone stayed firm, not unkind. "I'm not saying we should sweep it under the rug, but we've got to be strategic. The mayor's already pushing for an independent investigation, and look, I'll be straight with you, Officer Trent might not come out of this with his badge." Cleon's breath caught, a sudden pang of conflict piercing through his anger. Trent. The name conjured a weary figure with a quick temper and a chip on his shoulder. A young cop who'd let bias and bravado guide his hand when he'd slapped those cuffs on Cleon. The memory burned Trent's sneer, the jeers of the crowd, the flash of cameras, but hearing Vincent's words gave Cleon pause. Part of him wanted Trent gone, a clean cut to sever the embarrassment and the pain. But another part, quieter and more troubling, wondered if firing him was just a bandage on a gaping wound. Would it change anything, or would it let the department wash its hands of the deeper sin? "This isn't just about Trent," Cleon said softly, his gaze dropping to the desk, where papers lay scattered like fallen leaves. "It's about how we train people, how we let bias fester because we don't call it out. Getting rid of him won't fix that." Vincent nodded, slow and thoughtful, as if Cleon's words were sinking in. "You're right, but we've got to show the public we're doing something. If we don't, whatever trust we've got left will vanish." Cleon's mind raced, a whirlwind of hope and cynicism clashing within him. He wanted accountability, bone-deep change in it just for Trent, but for every officer who'd ever abused their power, for every citizen who'd suffered for it. Justice wasn't a scapegoat, it was a reckoning, but he knew the game too well. The mayor wanted a quick fix, a sacrificial lamb to quiet the chants outside, while the department clung to its optics like a lifeline. "What about the reforms I've been begging for?" Cleon asked, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "The bias training, the new arrest protocols, will have been kicking those down the road for months." Vincent sighed, leaning back in his chair, the creak of it echoing in the stillness. "I know they're needed, Cleon, I'm with you on that. But we're stretched thin, budget's tight, manpower's low, and right now, the brass is focused on damage control." Cleon's fists clenched beneath the desk, nails digging into his palms. The same tired excuses, year after year, money for riot gear and PR stunts, but never for the hard work of dismantling the rot. "I'm not asking for a miracle," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut. "But we've got to start somewhere. If we don't, what happened to me's going to keep happening. Not just to me, but to people out there who don't have a voice." Vincent's gaze softened, a flicker of something human breaking through his stern facade empathy. "Maybe, or regret." "I hear you, Cleon," he said quietly. "I do, and I'll fight for it. I promise you that." The words hung there, fragile but sincere, a lifeline in the churning sea of Cleon's doubt. Outside, the distant roar of the protests swelled, a reminder of the stakes off, the cost of power unchecked, and the slow, grinding pursuit of justice that might one day make it right. The air in Cleon's cramped office felt heavy, thick with the unspoken burdens that clung to every word exchanged between him and Chief Vincent Brooks. Outside, the faint hum of protest chants seeped through the walls, a relentless chorus of voices crying out for justice, for something better than the broken system they'd all been tangled in for too long. Cleon sat rigid in his chair, his broad shoulders squared as if bracing for a fight he'd been preparing for his entire career. His dark eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto Vincent's weathered face. The chief, with his graying hair and deep-set lines etched from years of hard decisions, leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the desk. There was a gravity in his posture, a quiet acknowledgement of the storm brewing just beyond their reach. "I'll back you up on those reforms," Vincent said, his voice low and steady, though it carried the weight of a man who'd seen too many battles lost to bureaucracy. "But you've got to realize it's not going to be smooth sailing. The pushback won't just come from the top brass-hose suits. In their cushy offices, it'll come from our own ranks too. People don't like admitting there's rot in the house they've built their lives around." Cleon's jaw tightened, a flicker of frustration sparking in his chest. He could feel with resistance Vincent warned off like a wall slowly rising to block every step he'd take. But fear, that wasn't what gnawed at him. "I'm not scared of a fight," he replied, his tone cutting through the room like a blade, firm and unshaken. "What terrifies me is sitting here, doing nothing while it all festers. I've seen what happens when we turn a blind eye, Chief. I won't let that be my legacy. Vincent's eyes softened for a moment, a rare crack in his stern facade, though the heaviness never left his expression. He gave a slow nod, as if weighing Cleon's resolve against the chaos they were about to wade into. "All right, then," he said, his voice taking on a measured cadence. "We'll tackle this one piece at a time. The mayor's office is prepping a statement should hit the airwaves soon. Word is, they're greenlighting an independent investigation. That'll give us some breathing room, buy us a few days to get our ducks in a row. I need you to draft up that proposal you've been preaching about, every reform, every change you've got in mind. We'll shove it through the cracks, but we've got to play this smart, Cleon, strategic, not reckless." For the first time that day, a faint spark of hope flickered in Cleon's chest, though it was quickly tempered by the bitter reality he knew all too well. Change didn't come fast, and it didn't come easy in a system so entrenched in its own flaws. The process would be a grueling slog, a marathon of red tape and hollow promises. But it was a start, a fragile thread of possibility he could cling to. "I'll have it on your desk by Friday," he said, his voice ringing with a quiet determination that left no room for doubt. Every detail locked and loaded. Vincent rose from his chair, his movements deliberate, the weight of his title etched into every step. His face remained serious, though the guarded edge he'd worn earlier softened just enough to reveal a glimmer of trust. "Good," he said, pausing as he adjusted his tie. "But listen, Cleon, watch yourself out there. This road's going to be rough, and the spotlight's going to burn hot. You're one of the best we've got, and I'll be damned if I lose you to this mess." His words hung in the air, a rare moment of vulnerability from a man who'd spent decades hiding behind the badge. Cleon met his gaze, his own eyes hard, but laced with a quiet gratitude. "I'm not going anywhere, Chief," he said, his voice steady as steel. "Not until we fix this, not until it's right." With a small, almost imperceptible nod, Vincent turned and slipped out of the office, the door clicking shut behind him with a soft finality. The moment he was alone, Cleon let out a long, shuddering breath, sinking back into his chair as the weight of it all crashed over him like a tidal wave. The conversation, the stakes, the years of frustration had pressed down on his shoulders, threatening to buckle him, but he wouldn't break, not now. He'd clawed his way through to muck nights of doubt. Days of watching good intentions crumble under corruption. Oh, let it end here. His phone buzzed on the desk, a sharp jolt that snapped him out of his spiraling thoughts. He reached for it, his fingers brushing the cool metal as he swiped the screen. Lydia's name glowed in the dim light, her message simple but piercing. "You okay?" For a moment, he just stared at it, his thumb hovering over the call button. He could almost hear her voice, warm, steady, a lifeline in the chaos that had swallowed his days. Lydia had always been his anchor, the one who could pull him back when the world felt like it was slipping away. But this fight, it was his to carry, at least for now. He typed a quick reply, his fingers moving with a hurried precision. "I'm fine, just swamped. See you tonight." He set the phone down, the silence swallowing the faint tap of the screen. Turning to his computer, Cleon stared at the blank document blinking back at him. The cursor pulsed like a heartbeat, a quiet challenge to put his resolve into words. There was so much to unpack, so many failures to address, so many lives hanging in the balance. But he couldn't let it overwhelm him. The reforms he dreamed of, fought for, were more critical now than ever. They were a lifeline not just for him, but for the people outside, their voices rising louder with every passing minute. He began to type, the rhythmic clack of the keys filling the stillness, a steady drumbeat against the roar of the protests beyond the precinct walls. Night crept in as he worked, the hours blurring into a haze of focus and fury. The events of the past day's mistaken arrest, the public outcry had rattled him to his core, but they'd also lit something fierce within him. A fire burned in his gut, a refusal to let this department, this life he'd poured himself into, rot away under the weight of its own sins. Justice wasn't just a word to him, it was a promise, a debt he owed to every soul who'd been failed by the system he'd sworn to uphold. And if that meant clawing his way through every obstacle, facing down every coward who'd rather bury the truth than fix it, then he'd fight until his last breath. Days later, Captain Cleon David sat at the long press conference table, his posture ramrod straight, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The room buzzed with restless energy, a sea of reporters packed shoulder to shoulder, their pens poised like weapons ready to carve the day's story into history. Camera flashes erupted in sporadic bursts, slicing through the dim light and casting stark shadows across the faces of the men seated beside him. To his right, Chief Vincent Brooks sat with a face carved from stone, his stern authority masking the exhaustion that clung to him like a second skin. Clean could see it in the faint slump of his shoulders, the way his eyes darted toward the windows where the chants of the growing crowd outside reverberated faintly. To Clean's left, the mayor perched with a practiced calm, his tailored suit and neutral smile shield against the political firestorm threatening to engulf him. He was a man more concerned with saving his own skin than seeking justice, and the protest outside had swelled into a living, breathing force, hundreds strong now, their voices a tidal wave of fury and hope, demanding accountability, demanding change. The sound seeped into the room, a constant pulse that underscored every word spoken at the table. Clean felt it in his bones. This wasn't just a press conference. It was a crucible, a moment that would define not just his career, but the soul of the department he'd given his life to. The mayor spoke first, his voice smooth and measured, a politician's polish honed by years of dodging accountability. "Good afternoon," he began, his gaze sweeping the room like a king addressing his court. "Thank you all for being here. We're gathered today to address the incident 2 days ago involving Captain Clean David. As many of you know, Captain David was mistakenly arrested by one of our own during a routine patrolling incident that has, understandably, shaken our community and beyond." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Let me be clear. What happened was unacceptable. We're committed to ensuring it doesn't happen again. To that end, we've launched an independent investigation and unflinching, and those responsible will face consequences." Clean listened, his face a mask of restraint. He knew the mayor's words were a performance carefully crafted to soothe, not solve. Accountability sounded noble, but he'd seen it dissolve into empty gestures too many times. He wanted more than promise. Wanted a reckoning, a dismantling of the rot that had festered too long. When the mayor finished, Vincent stood, his presence commanding despite the weariness tugging at him. "I echo the mayor's sentiments," he said, his voice a deep rumble. "As chief, I take full responsibility for this department's actions. We've been working on policies and training to address these issues, but it's not enough. We have to do more." His words carried a raw honesty, a crack in the armor of a man who'd spent years holding the line. The room shifted, a collective breath held as Clean rose to his feet. The murmurs faded, every eye locking onto him. He adjusted his jacket, the fabric crisp against his frame, and cleared his throat. The sound sharp in the stillness. "Thank you, Chief Brooks, Mr. Mayor, and everyone here today," he began, his voice steady, resonant, cutting through the tension like a blade. "I stand before you not just as an officer, but as someone who believes in what this department could be. What happened 2 days ago wasn't just a mistake, it was a symptom of something deeper, something we've ignored for too long." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, meeting the eyes of reporters, officials, and the unseen crowd beyond the walls. Justice isn't a buzzword, it's a fight. And when power's abused, when those we trust to protect instead harm, it's not just a betrayal of the badge. It's a betrayal of every person we swore to serve. I've spent my career trying to make this right, and I'm not stopping now. We need reform, real messy, hard-won reform, and I'll keep pushing, no matter the cost, because anything less is a failure I can't live with. The room erupted in a flurry of questions and camera clicks, but Clean stood tall, the fire in his chest burning brighter than ever. Outside, the crowd roared louder, their voices a mirror to his own, a demand for justice, a refusal to let the powerful bury their sins. And in that moment, he knew this was only the beginning. The air in the crowded room buzzed with anticipation as Captain Clean David stood behind the podium, his broad shoulders squared and his dark eyes scanning the sea of faces before him. 2 days earlier, an event had unfolded that shook him to his core, reverberating far beyond the confines of his personal life. It wasn't just about him, a decorated police captain. and a man deeply woven into the fabric of this community. It was a glaring spotlight on the deep-seated flaws festering within law enforcement, issues that had lingered like a stubborn stain for far too long. He paused deliberately, letting the weight of his words settle over the audience. The sharp clicks of camera shutters punctuated the silence, and he could see the reporters leaning forward, pens hovering over notebooks, their eyes glinting with the hunger for a story. This wasn't just a press conference for Cleon, it was a rare, trembling chance to ignite something real, to demand a shift in a system he'd spent his life upholding. "I was arrested," he began, his voice steady but laced with a raw edge, "by one of my own. An officer under my command, someone who looked at me and didn't see my rank, didn't see my years of service, didn't even see me as a person. He saw something else, something shaped by assumptions, by the color of my skin." The room fell deathly still, the tension so thick it seemed to press against the walls. Cleon's chest tightened as he spoke, his mind replaying the moment, the cold metal of handcuffs biting into his wrists, the confusion twisting into anger as he realized what was happening. This wasn't a one-off mistake, he continued, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. It's a symptom of something bigger, something ugly, a pattern carved deep into the bones of this department, built on racial bias and unchecked power, and it's been ignored for too long. He'd spent decades in this job, pouring his soul into bridging the gap between the police and the people they swore to protect. Every handshake, every late-night patrol, every community meeting, it had all been about trust, about showing that the badge meant something good. But now, standing there, the sting of betrayal pulsed through him. How could he fight for that trust when his own officers couldn't see past their prejudices? His pulse quickened, adrenaline surging as he leaned into the microphone. "This is a wake-up call," he said, his voice rising with conviction. "We need change, real, tangible change, not just words on a page or promises that fade when the cameras leave. We need training that digs into the roots of bias, protocols that don't bend under pressure, and accountability that doesn't flinch, not just when it's easy, but every single time, out in the open for everyone to see." The room seemed to hold its breath, the gravity of his words sinking in. Cleon's hands gripped the podium's edges, his knuckles whitening as he steadied himself. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, the chance to peel back the layers of silence and force the truth into the light. "This isn't just my story," he pressed on, his voice softening but no less resolute. "It's the story of too many others, people stopped, searched, judged, all because of how they look, where they come from. We owe them better. We owe this community a department that doesn't just talk about justice but lives it, breathes it, fights for it every day." A murmur rippled through the crowd, reporters shifting in their creaky chairs, pencils scratching furiously against paper. Cleon felt a fire ignite within him, a fierce determination that drowned out the nerves fluttering in his stomach. He wasn't done yet. "I'm calling on every officer in this department, me brothers and sisters in uniform, to stand with me," he said, his tone a blend of challenge and plea. "We can't keep pretending the problem doesn't exist. It starts with us. We have to look at ourselves, question what we've been taught, unlearn what holds us back. Together, we can rebuild what's been broken, piece by piece, until the people out there," he gestured toward the windows, "where faint chants from protesters echoed, can look at us and feel safe again." As he stepped back, the room erupted into a charged hush, the kind that hums with unspoken possibilities. Cleon's heart pounded in his chest, but there was a strange calm settling over him too. He'd laid it all bare, and the shift in the air was undeniable. Then, the mayoral weary man with graying hair and a perpetually furrowed brow stepped forward, clearing his throat with a nervous rasp. "Thank you, Captain David, for that powerful statement," he said, his voice measured but carrying an edge of sincerity. "The city stands behind you. We can't turn a blind eye to what's happening here. We'll work together. Forms, accountability, all of it. This is a commitment, not just to you, but to everyone out there demanding answers." The tension in the room began to unravel, giving way to a restless energy. Reporters sprang to life, their voices overlapping in a chaotic swell. "Captain David, how do you see these changes rolling out?" one shouted, her sharp tone cutting through the din. "Chief Brooks, what's the next move in the investigation?" another demanded, his notepad flapping as he waved it. "Mayor, how will you make sure the community's voices don't get lost in all this?" A third chimed in, her eyes narrowed with skepticism. Cleon stood there, the questions swirling around him like a storm, and for the first time in days, a flicker of hope sparked in his chest. He'd spoken his piece, bared his soul, and now the real work could begin. Outside, the protests hadn't quieted. If anything, they'd grown louder. A chorus of frustration and resolve that seeped through the building's walls. Cleon could picture some families holding signs, young activists with megaphones, older folks who'd seen too much and still hoped for better. Inside, the chief, a burly man named Brooks, with a face weathered by years on the force, shifted uncomfortably. Beside the mayor, he'd been silent through Cleon's speech, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between the captain and the crowd. Brooks wasn't a bad man, Cleon knew that much, but he was a product of the old guard, slow to adapt, quick to defend the way things had always been. Now, though, even he couldn't ignore the tide turning beneath their feet. The road ahead loomed large and daunting, a tangle of resistance and hard conversations. Cleon could already imagine the pushback officers grumbling about extra training, bureaucrats dragging their feet, skeptics dismissing him as a troublemaker. But as he stood there, the weight of the moment anchoring him, he felt ready. This wasn't just about what had happened to him 2 days ago. Though the memory still burned, the officer's curt commands, the way his badge had meant nothing, the humiliation of being hauled in like a stranger. No, this was about something bigger, a chance to reshape a department, to redefine what justice could look like. In the days that followed, the story spread like wildfire. Reporters dug into the details, piecing together the arrest, a routine patrol gone wrong. A young officer named Harris, who'd acted too fast, assumed too much. Harris wasn't a villain, not real, just a kid, barely 25, with a buzz cut and a nervous energy that Cleon remembered from roll calls. But that didn't erase the damage. The captain's face appeared on every news channel, his words replayed in endless loops, and the community latched onto them. Meetings were scheduled, petitions circulated, and Cleon found himself at the center of it all, a reluctant but resolute figurehead. Back in the precinct, the mood was a mix of unease and defiance. Some officers clapped him on the shoulder, whispering their support. Others avoided his gaze, their silence speaking volumes. Harris, the officer who'd arrested him, had been pulled aside that morning. Cleon had seen him in the hall, his face pale, his hands fidgeting as Brooks muttered something about procedure. The kid looked like he hadn't slept, guilt and confusion warring in his eyes. Cleon didn't hate him, how could he? Harris was just a cog in a machine that had been grinding the wrong way for years. But that didn't mean there wouldn't be consequences. What lingered most for Cleon, though, was the lesson etched into every second of this ordeal. Power unchecked was a poison. It warped judgment, eroded trust, and left wreckage in its wake. Justice wasn't just a word to throw around, it was a promise, one that demanded vigilance, humility, and the guts to face the mirror. He thought of the people he'd met over the years, mothers who'd lost sons, kids who flinched at sirens, neighbors who'd stopped believing help would come. This fight was for them, and for every officer who'd ever worn the badge with pride, but felt the system buckling beneath them. As the press conference faded into memory and the work began in earnest, Cleon stood taller, his resolve hardening with each step. The journey would be grueling, months, maybe years, of tearing down and rebuilding. But with every meeting, every policy rewrite, every hard-earned inch of progress, he knew they were clawing their way toward something better. A department that didn't just serve but listened. A community that didn't just fear but hoped. And a legacy that didn't just punish but healed.